Everything that is good in Western civilization comes from the Christian and Jewish tradition. And if you repudiate the Christian and Jewish tradition, you are trying to live off the scent of an empty vase. And you can't do it. Society can't do it. You need a very vibrant Christianity, in my view, for the West to survive. Let me say, I'm not a Christian so that the West can survive. But, incidentally, the West will survive as a part of the revival of Christianity.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what I think could be the Institute of Public Affairs' first public event for 2026. It's not January, but I'm going to say Happy New Year, Happy Australia Day. That's just an excuse to say that. My name is John Roskam. I am a senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and today we are going to be having a discussion with a great Australian, an Australian who you see reading and writing, an Australian who you see in the Australian regularly as an acute observer, not just of foreign affairs and of foreign policy, but of the condition of our culture and society. And of course, that is Greg Sheridan. Welcome, Greg. We are talking today about how Christians can succeed, reclaiming the genius of the early church, a wonderful book that I have enjoyed reading that has sold fabulously well throughout Australia and internationally. You would have met Deb outside. Deb is from Sun Books. Sun Books is an independent bookseller, many of you would know, in Yarraville, and we think it would be tremendous if we can support independent bookselling and move all the copies of Greg's books that Sun has brought here today. And of course, every book that is sold, Greg will sign. Christmas isn't too far away. You will want lots of copies for your friends, Christian or not, woke or not. The format of tonight is that we are relaxed and comfortable. As you can see, there's no lectern. We'll be talking and discussing. Greg is going to talk a little bit about the book and why it's so important. I'm then going to ask him some questions. I have got lots of audience questions, Greg, as I've been going around. Many of them involve Donald Trump, but we'll come to that. Because we're about to talk about the book, but Mike Pence is in the book, so that does allow us to talk about Donald Trump. We'll do that. And then we'll have time for audience questions. We're filming today, so we'd love your participation. Anything that you say untoward, we will edit out. Anything negative about Donald Trump, we will also edit out. And then we're going to go back to Deb and buy Deb's books for Christmas. So thank you for being with us. Greg, tell us how Christians can succeed today.
Well, John, thanks very much. Is that microphone working okay? Yep, that's good. My wife...
Close up. Just, yep.
My wife may well tell me to turn it down, but no. In fact, I'd like to introduce my wife before I start off. JC Sheridan, she's over there. Now, she certainly deserves a round of applause, but I have a purpose in introducing her. If I say anything in the next hour, which is particularly stupid, even by the standards of Australian journalism, please take it up with her. She'll sort the whole problem out. Before I just start on the book, I'd like to thank John Roskam for everything that he does, but also particularly for hosting tonight. It's an honour to share the platform with him. John has been a great intellectual leader in Australia for a long time. Not quite as long as me, although he's older than he looks, you know. And through his leadership of the IPA and his contributions more contemporaneously in his new role at the IPA and his newspaper columns and his private conversations, we've all benefited from John a great deal. And it's a thrill to be at an IPA event and to be at an IPA platform. I'm full of admiration for the IPA. It's a think tank which thinks, but it's also a tank. It fights. It's a fighting think tank. And Thinking and fighting are two qualities we lack in Australian politics. And by fighting, I mean fighting honourably the battle of ideas. Anyway, enough of that throat clearing. Now, I'm only going to talk at absolute maximum for about 10 minutes and then I'll stop. Although I have a very strong Fidel Castro instinct in me, and it's easy for me to go on for 8 or 9 hours. So if
Trump went on for 2 hours today.
yeah, he's a poltroon. He's a slacker. A mere 2 hours, you know. So if you find after 8 or 9 hours, you know, you could prompt John to say, time. So how did this book come about? So I'm the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper, and I haven't lost interest in foreign affairs or anything. I've been a full-time professional journalist for 47 or 48 years. 5 years with the Bulletin magazine, which doesn't exist anymore, and 42 and a half years now with the Australian. I've been foreign editor since 1992. So if anybody tells you young folks there or your kids or grandkids they need to move around and be flexible in their careers, that's absolute baloney. You just take a strong grip on your desk and never let go, you know? And I've always been a believing Christian, but about 10 or 15 years ago I realised Christianity was under constant attack. Happenstance had given me a microphone and I ought to use it to defend my friends and to defend the truth. Now I've ended up writing a trilogy of Christian books, and they actually have some intelligent design about them, but this is a very good illustration of how the theory of evolution can fit with intelligent design, because I had no idea what I was doing when I was writing them, but looking back I can see there was a design, a purpose, a structure even in them. The first was called God is Good for You, a defence of Christianity in troubled times. That was really an answer to the new atheists and a celebration of the Old Testament, because the new atheists hated the Old Testament. I read the new atheists, so you don't have to. They are a pile of junk. I can't believe how feeble they were. In fact, it was good that I had to read them, although I earned a lot of remission time in purgatory. I know that not all of you believe in purgatory, but it's a very good doctrine for journalists, let me tell you. And that was essentially a book about God. Who is God? What do we know of God? Why the existence of God is perfectly reasonable and the most reasonable explanation we can possibly have for the cosmos. The second book, somebody said to me, that's all very well, Greg, but where is the living Jesus in your book? Doesn't take much to provoke an addicted book writer. In fact, I'd tell you, book writing is a lot like taking heroin. It's better if you don't start, really. But once you start, you can't stop. And so the second book then, Christians, The Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World, was an attempt to find Jesus, both the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith, see if they were the same person, and find them primarily through the New Testament, but also through the contemporary followers of Jesus. And I read the New Testament as a journalist, and I found that everything we can test historically in the New Testament is true. All the old 19th century scholarship which said the New Testament was baloney is in fact baloney, and every new archaeological discovery validates something else in the New Testament. You don't believe the New Testament because the archaeological evidence has finally caught up with reality, but in an age which is so sceptical of the Bible, it's worth knowing that all the scholarly evidence now validates the Bible. And then this third book, How Christians Can Succeed Today, Reclaiming the Genius of the Early Church, is about the first Christian people, the first followers of Christ, especially after he had gone. So they were moderns like us. They didn't have Jesus standing beside them. If Jesus was physically standing beside me, even a coward like me might feel brave for a moment. But they were like us. They didn't have Jesus physically standing beside them. And yet they dealt with a culture far more unsympathetic and hostile to them than we're dealing with today. They transformed the culture, spread the gospel, and experienced really extraordinary historic triumph. So looking back at the books, I can see now that one was about God, one was about Jesus, and one was about the Holy Spirit working through the first Christians. So there was a trinity as well as a trilogy. I also look back and see that this was my attempt to save Western civilization. Now, it might be pretty feeble, you reckon, but still better to contribute. There's a beautiful book that Pierre Ryckmans wrote called The Burning Forest, based on the Chinese proverb that it was better when you see a burning forest, the dove flew across and wept over the forest so that at least his tears would contribute to dousing the flames. And maybe you can't do more than that, but it's still worth doing that. Why do I say it was my effort to save Western civilization? For the last couple of 100 years, the predominant cultural project in the West has been disenchantment, what Max Weber called the project of disenchantment. The idea of disenchantment is that human beings are nothing special. There's no poetry or transcendent meaning about human beings. And disenchantment is based on interlocked propositions. God is dead, the Old Testament is wicked, obviously untrue, deeply wicked, and the New Testament is a complete fiction. Now, my book answers those three projects of disenchantment and is an attempt to re-enchant our lives, to show the purpose, their divine purpose. And each of the books has a half dealing with the ideas and a half dealing with the experience of contemporary Christians living this out. Now, the early Christians, I'll wrap up with a few points about the early Christians. The early Christians particularly repay our attention today because the Greco-Roman pagan world was a savage and vicious world, and it was tremendously hostile to Christianity. It was more hostile than our culture is today to Christianity. Of course, Christians in many parts of the world today are persecuted in the way they were in the Greco-Roman world. In China, in North Korea, in parts of Africa, in other parts of Asia, in parts of Pakistan. But we in the West are not persecuted, we just face a hostile culture. And in many ways it is a neo-pagan culture. If you're under 45 or 50 today, there's a good chance you've never made a serious encounter with Christianity at all. Yet every good thing we like in our culture comes from the Christian and the Jewish traditions. Human rights, universalism. Universalism was there in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, when God created human beings in the likeness and image of God. The ancient world have never thought of human beings in that guise before. And universalism was even more explicit in the New Testament. There is Paul's famous saying, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." And the pagan Greco-Roman world was consumed with the same sort of identity politics we're consumed with today. It was where you were born that counted. Were you a firstborn son? Were you born a property holder? Were you born a citizen of Rome? Which tribe did you come from? Women were inferior to men. Slaves were inferior to their masters. Second and third-born sons were inferior to firstborn sons. And this played out in all aspects of pagan life. I mean, girl babies were much less valued than boy babies, so they were frequently killed at birth or left out to die. As a result, there was a tremendous male-female imbalance of population. The early Christians challenged all this. They challenged it in principle, and they lived their lives a different way. So they didn't kill their girl babies, indeed they rescued other girl babies left out to die. As a result, their families had a lot more girls than pagan families did. As a result, they were much happier. Can you imagine anything more ghastly than a society comprised only of blokes? It's almost unspeakable. It's inconceivable. I made that joke, by the way, in the Australia Club once, thinking it was a completely innocent joke. They thought I was having a shot at their men-only membership. So I got 2 rounds of laughter out of that joke at the Australia Club, and you know, it was completely innocent. But the early Christians, I think, repay our attention today because they were deliberate, conscious, considered, determined in what they did. They made a cultural challenge to the culture they lived in. They used legal remedies wherever they could. This is very interesting about Paul. Paul was a Roman citizen, unusual for a Jew from the end of the empire, as he was, but he was a citizen, a Roman citizen, and so whenever he was called before court for preaching his Christian heresies, he claimed the rights of a Roman citizen and argued before the courts and so forth. The early Christians didn't seek martyrdom. They didn't go out trying to become martyrs. They just tried to live decent lives and to be free to spread the gospel. But they had clear red lines that they wouldn't cross. So the Roman authorities said to them, well, we won't persecute you if you'll worship Caesar and worship the Roman gods. Christians said, no, we'll pray for Caesar, we won't pray to Caesar. And the Roman authorities said, well, you can have Jesus as one of the pantheon of Roman gods if you like. He can join the pantheon, but you've got to make sacrifices to the others as well. They said, no, we won't do that. And, you know, this is a far-fetched comparison in a way, but it reminds me of those Manly rugby league players a few years ago who were asked to wear the LGBT, the pride jerseys. Now, as far as I know, none of them had ever made an adverse statement ever about a gay person in any circumstance. They weren't running any campaign against gay people, nothing like that. There's no reason to think they had any prejudice at all. But they weren't going to let their bodies be used as instruments to spread an ideology that was against their principles. So they said, no, we won't do it. They didn't hold a demonstration. They're not political people. They didn't go on radio. You know, they're not articulate that way. And each of them was taking enormous risk. Of course, as a professional footballer, you've only got a few years to earn the big bucks. Everyone was against them when they did that, and they could have all lost their careers quite easily, but they said, well, you know, you can do whatever you like, but you're not putting that jersey on us. We're not going to hold. And so Manly played the game without them, lost every game for the rest of the season, and the league has never tried to do that again. And all those men were vindicated, and they all went on to have good careers. But that was a sign, really, I thought a quite magnificent sign of people who just had a red line that they wouldn't cross at potentially tremendous cost to themselves. Now, we're not comprehensively a neo-pagan society. There are still plenty of Christians in our society, and there are plenty of post-Christians, especially baby boomers who had a little bit of Christianity in their childhood but have kind of become immune to it. But our young people today are, without any pejorative element to this word, they are genuine pagans in the sense that they haven't been introduced to monotheism. You know, pagan gods, there's an argument about whether being a pagan is being religious because you worship pagan gods. Well, there are plenty of pagan gods that we worship today, you know, the environment, woke identity, politics and so forth. That's why politics is going mad, because it's substituting political objectives for true transcendent meaning. But the pagan gods are nothing like the Christian god of monotheism or the Jewish god of monotheism or any sense of a monotheistic god, Sikhs or Zoroastrians or indeed Muslims. The monotheistic god is completely different from the pagan gods. The pagan gods don't care about humanity. They don't impose an ethical life. They really want sacrifice and piety paid to them, but they not really care much about human beings. The God of Christianity is completely, radically different from that. But I'll finish on this note. Our young pagan folks are terrific potential recruits for Christianity. C.S. Lewis said that pagans are Christians in the making, just Christians waiting. And the last few years, I had to rewrite the introduction of this book, because the last few years across the West has seen this tremendous boom in the conversion of young people to Christianity. So the Zoomers, the statistical decline of Christianity has stopped in the United States, most of Western Europe, and possibly even in Australia, because the Zoomers, the Generation Z, and even the generation after them, are much more religious than anybody had ever expected. There was a YouGov poll in Britain which found that amongst 16 to 20-year-olds, regular church-going had increased from 4% to 16%. Well, 16% is still pretty small, but that is an astonishing increase across a couple of years. Archbishop Commonsolme tells me that on Easter Sunday, St Patrick's Cathedral will baptise 530 new Catholics, the biggest number they've ever had on a single Easter. And this is happening all over the Western world. And let me say, my books are very non-denominational and proceed from first principles. This is happening to all Christian denominations who are gospel-based, who believe in Jesus of the gospel. And this is good news for non-religious people as well, because as a lot of people who don't believe in Christianity, finally, like Douglas Murray and Tom Holland, recognise everything that is good in Western civilization comes from the Christian and Jewish tradition. And if you repudiate the Christian and Jewish tradition, you are trying to live off the scent of an empty vase, as Ernst Renan put it. And you can't do it. Society can't do it. You need a very vibrant Christianity, in my view, for the West to survive. Let me say, I'm not a Christian so that the West can survive, but incidentally, the West will survive as a part of the revival of Christianity. So there's every reason to be hopeful, because as a wiser man than I once said, we follow a God who knows his way out of the grave. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Greg. Thank you. You've given us hope, and we're optimistic. As I've said, I've read How Christians Can Succeed Today. I've learned so much from it. I was challenged by so much of it. I was particularly challenged by the beginning when, as you've just said, Greg, Christians are, if not persecuted, certainly not welcome in Western society today, in the modern world. I wasn't very comforted when you said, but it's not as bad as the early church. What are you went through some of them. What are the lessons from the early church for not just Christians today, but let me say those who might be broadly of a conservative disposition, or those who would stand against the modern trends of our culture? What are the lessons? What should we be thinking about?
Well, John, I'd never write anything to discomfort you, of course, but, you know, it's very kind of you to have read the book, really. You know, one thing as an author, if anyone says, I liked your book, you never ever say something like, which part did you like best? You just say, God bless you, sir or madam. And in fact, I was at one event in Queensland a few years ago that the IPA ran. John might remember this. A guy got up from the crowd and he said, you've written a very annoying book. It's very irritating. It's full of stylistic solecisms. You make a million mistakes. It's a very, very annoying book. It's so annoying, he said, that I've bought 3 copies to send to each of the people I most want to annoy. And I had to say, well, you're doing God's work, sir. And what a great cover line for, the perfect book for the person you most want to annoy, But seriously, so look, I must say, honestly, I'm a Christian believer. So there was a long time where I tried to just sort of glide around that. But look, being a Christian believer is not the same as being a serial murderer, So everybody is allowed to bring their whole identity to public debate, except Christians, apparently, or conservative Christians. Social justice Christians can, but not conservative Christians. But the early Christians really repay our study, and it was great fun to write this book, because the early Christians are a lot like John Roskam and the people at the IPA. They couldn't stop writing. They wrote lots of things down. They wrote to each other. Lots of people wrote about them. So there's a terrific amount of Roman and Greek writing about the early Christians. And they were real flesh and blood human beings. So very early on, first Christian community tries to live by what you might call the precepts of Christian socialism. Everybody puts their wealth in the middle and we just take what we need. And after about 5 minutes, they thought, hey, all these guys are not working. What can we do about them? How do we make them? So Paul said, okay, we've got a new rule. If you don't work, you don't eat. And
very IPA.
Very IPA. Very IPA. So the first welfare reform came with the very first Christians. And the description of the first Christian community at the end of Acts is, as I say, sort of pure Christian socialism. It befits a monastery or something, but it doesn't work for a general community. So you look after people who can't work, you look after the widows and the poor. The early Christians practiced real social welfare for people who couldn't provide for themselves, especially widows and orphans. But they quickly insisted that you were welcome to come as you are, but once you joined, there are a few things you had to do, one of which was work. They were terrifically countercultural, and they never tried to hide this. They didn't go out of their way to hurt the good things in the culture. They looked for the good things in the culture. So there are a lot of good things in our culture. You know, sport, cricket, Aussie rules, rugby league, these are good things. And conservatives or Christians celebrate these things. In fact, I'm sure the practice rate of Christianity among full-time footballers is much higher than it is in the society at large. Certainly, I mean, I apologise for this to a Melbourne audience, but I'm a rugby league tragic, and I'm you know, three great institutions in my life: News Corporation, the Catholic Church, and the Canterbury Bankstown Bulldogs. And the Bulldogs, as you know, are a very Islander team. And whenever they score a try, you see them gather in the middle of the field, the sign of the cross, thanking God and so forth. God is an active presence in their life. So one thing early Christians did was they looked for the good things in the culture, they celebrated and they baptised the good things. So they, as it were, they appropriated the good things. But the bad things in the culture, they simply told everybody this is no good. So I've got a chapter on the sexual revolution that the early Christians brought about, especially in Corinth, which was a wild, corrupt city, even by the Greco-Roman standards. And in fact, you know, the verb to Corinthianize was to practice prostitution. It was a city about which other cities made terrible jokes, you know, much the same way as the rest of Australia views Sydney today, I suppose, really. But I didn't really say that. But so the Christians were very clear, this is a bad way to live. They didn't actually try to enforce it by law. They had no power over the law. They had no backers. But they were very clear this was a bad way to live. And this earned them enormous unpopularity because Roman life was so barbaric and so horrible, it had few enough diversions, and one of those diversions was orgies, and now Christians were saying you couldn't enjoy that either. Christians were also very uncompromising about the radical nature of their beliefs. There's a wonderful passage where Paul is being held in custody by the Roman official Festus. And Festus says, look, Paul, you're a really good guy. I like you very much. You're very, very smart. I've really enjoyed having conversation with you. But stop telling people they're going to rise from the dead, okay? That's really creepy and it's not good for social harmony and we don't like it. So if you just shut up about that, we'll let you go. And you can imagine all Paul's advisors saying, well, Paul, you know, we must practice enculturation. We must listen to the signs of the times. This culture is not ready for such a radical doctrine as that. Why don't you just emphasise Christian good works and charitable giving? So Paul finally gets to talk for himself. He jumps up and says, I want to proclaim that Jesus Christ is the first risen from the dead in the flesh, and that all of you too will rise from the dead in the flesh and be judged. And Festus says, you're mad, Paul. You're just completely mad. You've read too many books and you're staying in custody. But the great thing about Paul was he was going to proclaim his beliefs any opportunity he got. He didn't trim the beliefs. He didn't compromise them. And Christian beliefs always embody a paradox. They are true and they speak to the deepest truths of the human heart, and yet they always live within a deep mystery. So most human beings, to give you one illustration, most human beings have worked out that there is a God and that we're created by God and there's some moral purpose to our existence. But then the nature of God, the nature of immortal life, these are profound mysteries which we can only ever approach in metaphor. We can never really unravel. So the truth is both intuitive, familiar to us in a way. It feels like our real identity. But at the same time, it's mysterious and we can't understand it. And the early Christians never skipped the mystery. They never compromised the radical nature of their beliefs. They weren't persecuted all the time in the Greco-Roman world. There were long periods of time where they had relative stability, but persecution could happen at any time. The other thing, the final thing about them is they did really practice all the good elements of Christianity. So there's an early famous physician, Galen. There were two great plagues that I write about, the Galen plague and the Cyprian plague. Terrible plagues, thousands of people dying a day. Galen wrote about the Christians. They're very, very strange people. They endure death. They endure martyrdom stoically. They don't run away in plagues. They stay to help people. And they practice monogamy. What a bunch of weirdos. And the performance of Christians in the plagues meant that, oddly enough, fewer of them died because a lot of them acquired immunity. And then they looked after each other. So even if you get basic care when you're sick with a plague, you have a much better chance of survival if somebody will give you drink and water when you're too feeble to get it for yourself. And as a result, at the end of the plague, they were a much bigger proportion of the population than they were at the start of the plague. But much more important, they had a tremendous reputation from the people around them because they saw, the Roman authorities were telling them that Christians were corrupt and evil, but people could look with their own eyes and see there's something fair dinkum about those Christians. So that and a million other... and the final thing, John, a wonderful consolation we can take was they were always bickering with each other. They were constantly arguing. They say, no, that's not the best strategy. No, you've got to give your preferences to one nation. No. And they're always in disagreement with each other. There's a wonderful passage in Paul's letter to the Galatians where he says, I wish all those people misleading you Galatians would go and castrate themselves. And when I first read that, I thought, gee, I haven't heard that passage in church very often. You know, this is pretty vigorous language for an apostle of peace. Now, no doubt he was speaking metaphorically. I mean, I assume he was. Perhaps he was making a joke across 2,000 years. So the other thing about them is they're real flesh and blood human beings. And they dealt with all the practical difficulties of life, fundraising and shirkers and everything else. So I think they repay study, John.
Does modern Christianity compromise too much? Does modern Christianity have to understand that it is largely now a countercultural movement with all of the consequences that entails?
Yes, so I think that's right, John. In an earlier book, I wrote a last chapter about a bold minority. And I always try in the last chapter of these books to suggest what the strategies might be going forward. There's every reason to be hopeful and optimistic, and also, as Lenin said, the only question that counts is what is to be done. And nothing is worse than conservative essays of cultural despair. I read a lot of those as a young man, and if you don't commit suicide after you've read them, you just think to yourself, well, look, I'd rather go to the races. Everything is finished anyway, we're all doomed. I'll forget about it, you know, I'll just go to the beach or something. And there's no reason to have an attitude of cultural despair. But I do think it has been a very big adjustment for Christians and especially Christian leaders to recognise that we've gone from an age of Christendom, where we may have been very hypocritical. I mean, no one need idealise the past. I mean, I think we're a good nation. I strongly agree with Tony Abbott's history of Australia. The positive far outweighs the negative. But there were lots of bad things in the past, lots of villains in the past. The past was a foreign country. It had different demons, but it had plenty of its own demons. But nonetheless, it was an age of Christendom. The chief plausibility structure was Christian. The way you understood the world was Christian. We've gone from that to now a kind of a neo-pagan age. So in Christian terms, we've gone from a Christendom age to an apostolic age. But that's a bit churchy, isn't it? If you don't want to be churchy about it, you might say we've gone to an age where we need to be a bold minority. Now that suits someone like me because I'm an Irishman. So I want to blow bridges up. You know, I'm not acquainted with defending cities. I just want to cause trouble. You know, I want to use my gunpowder. I want to make a big noise. It's great to be in the minority, to be a guerrilla. But to understand that you're in the minority is very important because it equips you properly psychologically for the battle so that you don't feel when Christianity is attacked, what is this outrageous offence against orthodoxy and something that everyone understands? You think, well, that's just normal. And here's an opportunity to engage in the battle of ideas. I do think all Christians have some obligation to own their faith publicly. I mean, not everyone is a spruiker and a newspaper columnist and all the rest of it, but everybody interacts with lots of non-Christians, and it's, without forcing your beliefs on anybody, it's good to be open and straightforward and public. And when you are, you offer solidarity to fellow Christians, and you offer leadership to the society, and you offer a glimpse of the truth to non-Christians. So it's all upside. Now, I am a friend of every Christian in these books. They are very non-denominational. And I remember in researching one book going from the Planet Shakers Pentecostal church here in Melbourne to the most sublimely orthodox Benedictine monastery in Tasmania, which had its liturgy and its chanting in Latin. And the rock and roll songs at Planet Shakers and the Latin psalmic chants in the Benedictine monastery were using the same passages of the same Bible. So that's a stylistic difference. It's not really a fundamental difference, and we ought to transcend. I mean, I accept denominational doctrinal differences are important, but nonetheless, it's the Irish disease to agree on 99% of everything and then fight to the death over the 1%. So, but the only Christians that I'm a bit unsympathetic with, to finish on this note, is liberal Christians, because I'm in favour of every Christian who can assert the Apostles' Creed. But liberal Christians can't really assert the Apostles' Creed because they don't believe that the resurrection really took place. They think it was a metaphor, or that the miracles are metaphors. Well, if they're metaphors, as I say, I'm going to the races. Just forget about it. If it's no more important than a Netflix drama well made, I have no interest in it. If it's all lies, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, if he didn't ascend to heaven, that means those things in the Gospels are lies. And if the central things in the Gospel are lies, why would you believe anything in the Gospel, including its ethical message? So the one group of Christians that I've been accused of being a bit mean to are liberal Christians, and my response to that is normally a becoming silence.
A couple more questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. Talking about what has happened, is the secularisation of the world today an inevitable consequence of political liberalism? What has caused this change?
The cause of the change is many-dimensional, profound. There are long-term causes and short-term causes. I don't think it's an inevitable result of political liberalism, but affluence, extreme affluence, is a challenge to Christianity. I mean, who was it? Tertullian or one of the others who said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the faith. Well, we don't want, if we can, we want to avoid that circumstance. But on the other hand, if you are tremendously affluent for a very, very long time, you start to embrace the fiction that you no longer need God's mercy. Every human being stands in radical need of God's mercy because at any moment the human being can face annihilation. Every human life, in a sense, ends in tragedy. We're all going to experience a tragedy, the loss of loved ones and so on, all through our lives. And indeed, in the second half of this book, I profile a number of Christians who are very successful at spreading the gospel and a number of others who have just extended forgiveness, like Danny and Lila Abdullah. You know, their 3 children were run down by a drunken, drug-affected motorist. They forgave him. They forgave him the next day. They've befriended him. He's become a convert to Christianity in jail. They pray together. They're friends. He's converted to their version of Christianity. Now, there's nothing inevitable about the new paganism. Nothing inevitable at all. And I believe, John, profoundly, and I suspect you do too, there's nothing inevitable anywhere. All of history is up for grabs.
We make our own history.
We make our history. We are not without agency. We are not the inanimate objects of great historical forces. We are the authors of our own destiny. And indeed, there are other societies which have become affluent, which have not, and relatively liberal, which have not gone down the particular odd cul-de-sac of Western societies. But as I say, it's too early to be definitive about it, but it is tremendously encouraging to see this rebirth of Christianity amongst the Zoomers. You know, you're familiar with Jordan Peterson. JC and I in London witnessed 30,000 people, most of them, 60% of them young men, paying 20 or 40 quid each or something to listen to Jordan Peterson for 3 hours. That's kind of astounding, and there are good and bad things. There's elements of the Christian revival that are a bit problematic. That's natural because it consists of human beings, and human beings are always a bit problematic. But this Christian revival is very exciting. And there have been times in the past, You know, I think in the 1700s, there's a particular date, I've forgotten the year, when St Paul's Cathedral in London had 16 worshippers at the Easter service, and there were 10,000 sex workers walking the streets of London. And you would have said, Christianity is finished in England. And then along came Wilberforce and Wesley and a huge, huge revival of Christianity. We've seen the successive awakenings in America. There have been times in Australia when the practice rate has been as low or lower than it is now, and then you've seen revivals. So it's all to fight for, you know. At the worst, it's half time and we're a bit behind, but we've surged well just before half time. I think we are Queensland coming from behind in the second half of a state of origin contest, and you always know how that ends.
Greg, you make these references. How long have you actually lived in Melbourne?
20 years.
So a couple of questions from the audience, and then we'll open it up to others. Greg, is Australia still a Christian country?
No, I don't think we are. I think a minority of Australians are believing Christians, but it's a big minority. Our institutions bear the inheritance of Christianity, but very bad governments at state and federal level are doing everything they can to unpick that inheritance. It's right that we battle this strenuously, vigorously, that we fight for these institutions. But there's another thing we need to do as well. We need to create our own culture. As well as fighting the battle for this culture, we need to create our own culture in a very, very minor way. That's what I'm trying to do with these books. That's what Tony Abbott's doing with his History of Australia. You know, when my kids were at school, they had to study something about the US-Australia alliance, and they said to me, "Where can we find a book, Dad, that's in favour of the US-Australia alliance?" And even then...
You wrote it.
Well, that's why I wrote it. I had to write it. So I wrote it.
I reviewed it, yeah.
God bless you, John. And, you know, authors often write things because their kids ask them questions. But I see, as I say, you only need a very little excuse, you know, to write a book. It's what the IPA does with this fantastic education program that they're going to build around Tony Abbott's book and so on. It's what Campion College has done, in creating Australia's first and only liberal arts college, which, although it's a Catholic college, it has a broader cultural remit because it's based around the great books of our civilisation. So because we're no longer a Christian society, that gives us the freedom to be a really creative minority, to create a minority culture, to argue to the mainstream culture what is good for it, to try to reclaim and revive the Christian elements of our institutions without feeling that we have to defend the status quo because we no longer possess the status quo.
To go beyond that to contemporary politics, and I've already mentioned his name, I think, 2 or 3 times, and about half of you have wanted me to ask Greg this question. Greg, why don't you like Donald Trump? Isn't he the best thing for Christians in the world for a long time? Not my question, your question.
Now, as I was saying about the earlier book, nobody is ever embarrassed by a question. They can only ever be embarrassed by their own answers. So let me now sally forth to create my own embarrassment. Covering Trump as a conscientious journalist is a very challenging task. There are 2 obvious mistakes you can make about Trump. One is to think that Trump is the devil incarnate and everything he does is bad. That's stupid. However, the other mistake is to think Trump is the modern Cyrus the Builder from the Old Testament, who has enabled the rebuilding of the temple and everything he does is good. Frankly, that's also ridiculous. And what I try to do with Trump is analyse what he does more than what he says. What he says is not unimportant. The words of a president are important. Nonetheless, what he does is more important than what he says. He does a lot of very good things. So he doesn't say at his best, I've written this in many columns. Many columns I get attacked, and goodness knows I'm sure I get it wrong most of the time, but many times I get attacked in the same column from the people who love Trump and the people who hate Trump. Simultaneously, the people who hate Trump say, you lick-spittle, corrupt, second-rate journalist, you've been bought and paid for, you love Trump, you never criticise him. And for the very same column, the next comment will say, you second-rate globalist, follower of the United Nations, sellout, patsy, don't understand nationalism, you're not a real Christian, you won't fight for it. And I think I'd like to introduce you fellas to each other. But in a sense, they both have a point. I'm in neither camp. I am not for Trump or an against. I would say this, I would have voted for Trump against Joe Biden. I would have voted for Trump against Kamala Harris, and I would have voted for Trump against Hillary Clinton. But that's not to say I don't have criticism of Trump. A lot of what Trump says and does is grotesque. It's insane. In fact, there are times I don't know how people can follow Trump because he changes his position 12 times within one day. And to follow him faithfully, you've either got to remain silent for the whole day and wait until the end, then you can jump, or you've got to say, yes, I agree, this, NATO is the worst thing in the history of the world and we're not going to have anything to do with it. Oops, no, now I think I've revived NATO and it's absolutely fantastic and it's the natural alliance of all. Oh, no, I think Russia is right about Ukraine. Those Ukrainians caused this war. Oh, no, the First Lady told me Vladimir Putin bombed a hospital and that made me very upset and maybe Putin has been tapping me along all. Oh, no, it's Zelensky, he's the problem. Honestly, I get vertigo just following it, but I don't feel any sense of allegiance to it or hostility to it. What I try now, as hard as I can, is to measure each action of Trump's in its own accord. So Trump gives us a bigger American defence budget than we would have under any president. That is a very good thing in my view, a very good thing for Western civilization. Trump forces the European NATO allies to spend more money on defence. That's a very, very good thing in my view. Trump has secured the southern border. That's a very good thing in my view, a very, very good thing. Trump threatens to invade Greenland. That's bananas. That's just frankly bananas. Trump talks about Christianity in a grotesque fashion. He says, the only thing I disagree with Charlie Kirk about is loving your enemies. I hate my enemies. And I am the avatar of Christianity. Excuse me, have you ever opened the gospel? I hate my enemies and I am the best Christian you've ever seen. There's just a certain cognitive dissonance there. So all I can do, good soldier schmick, is try to, one action after another. I'm not going to condemn anything good that Trump does because it's Trump. I'm not going to excuse anything bad Trump does because it's Trump. And there it is.
That is a wonderful way to conclude our discussion. I'm going to ask Greg a final question and then I'm going to encourage you to go and see Deb from Sun Books and support your favourite independent bookseller. Greg, the title of your wonderful book, How Christians Can Succeed Today, has a subtitle, Reclaiming the Genius of the Early Church. What was the genius of that early church and what is the message we can continue to take forward in 2026?
Well, John, the second half of that book deals with contemporary Christians who I think are living out the lessons of the early church. Some in the heroic way they lived their ordinary lives. There's a wonderful woman, Jess Echeverry, who was homeless herself for 7 or 8 years. And now she's a wonderfully, happily married, successful woman, but she ministers to the homeless in Los Angeles and California. Going back onto the street, she said, was the hardest thing she ever did. But God told her that the homeless were his children and they needed someone to look after them. So she goes out and looks after them. But I also profile a number of great Christian communicators. One is Dallas Jenkins, who created the TV series The Chosen. So The Chosen is a TV rendition of the gospel, Jesus and the disciples. It has some backstory beyond the gospel, but it's all in sympathy to the gospel. There's nothing, he has theological advisors from the major denominations. He's very faithful to the truths of the gospel. Now, he tried to get funding for it. Hollywood wouldn't fund it. not out of religious sectarianism, but just they thought, who's going to want to read, who's going to want to watch a TV series about Jesus and the disciples? Give me a break, you know. We'll have yet one more series about, you know, a female submarine commander who works out that the CIA is really the work of the devil and, you know, exposes the corruption of the White House and blah, blah, yakety yak. So Dallas Jenkins crowdfunded the first season of The Chosen, and he raised $10 million US for it. Now, $10 million, quite a lot of money. On the other hand, to finance a whole TV miniseries, it's not much money, but it allowed Dallas Jenkins to do a professional job. He used pre-existing sets. You know, there's a Mormon set which recreates a biblical scene, and a few other denominations. They all lent him their sets and so forth. He hired professional actors, and the first season was a very slow burn. No TV station wanted to run it, and it, you know, non-Christians thought, why would I want to watch that? Christians thought, yeah, I should watch it, but it's going to be very poor entertainment. You know, I'd rather watch Breaking Bad or something. And then people started to watch it, and by word of mouth, it became very successful. So much so that then he did a second series. He crowdfunded that, raised another $10 million. Now it's in series 6 or 7. And when I interviewed him for this book, well over 500 million people around the world have seen at least one episode from start to finish. It's seen in a samizdat basis in countries where it's illegal to be a Christian. He's not trying to make money out of it, so he allows it to be on many, many platforms, and you can just get it through the app. Hundreds of millions of people have seen it. It's now changed Hollywood's view of because, you know, Hollywood is ideological, but nothing speaks louder than money. And there's a big Christian audience out there and a big non-Christian audience interested in Christian stories, so they now have a different view about doing Bible-based stories. Dallas Jenkins himself has a whole lot of other projects in the works, and the lesson of all that is that the cultural gatekeepers said, no, we won't fund you, we won't screen you, we're not interested. He said, is there a way I can go around the cultural gatekeepers? Is there enough support out there to do something independent of the cultural gatekeepers? And now it's so successful that it has changed the view of the cultural gatekeepers. Now that's just one operational lesson. That's just one operational lesson. You don't need to accept the diktats of the cultural gatekeepers. Now, not everyone is Dallas Jenkins, but people donated money to it. You know, they contributed to its success. And the other thing, as I say, about the early Christians is they were really genuine about their beliefs. In the end, they didn't have a compromise available to them. They couldn't say, yes, I believe, but only so long as it doesn't cost me anything. Because there was always a danger that it would cost them everything. And if you proclaimed belief, you just had to live with the consequences of that. And I think conservatives are called to that today. You know, it's an unfashionable position. You're not going to get an honorary doctorate from Melbourne University or Sydney University for services to conservatism or anything like that, you know. But it's great fun. The other thing is they just had so much fun. You know, there's so much fun in religion. There's so much fun in the Old Testament. There's so much fun in the New Testament. The early Christians enjoyed themselves. They had great stories to tell. They liked telling the stories. They made a whole lot of new friends. You know, when Paul went to the first church he founded in Philippi, which was founded by Lydia, I think, he went to a place where people were known to come to pray. It wasn't even really a synagogue. It was sort of fellow travellers of Jews of the time. There were no men there. There were only women there. Women tend to be more religious than men. That's not quite true in the current Generation Z boom, but it's true historically. And that reflects poorly on men, really. But Paul was happy to talk to this group of apparently disenfranchised women. But one of them was an affluent merchant, Lydia. He converted her, she founded a church, and that became the first Christian church in Europe. And everything that follows we owe to Paul, but we also owe to Lydia, a cloth merchant who just happened to go to the prayer centre that day, listen to Paul, and the rest, as they say, is history. So the other lesson to take from them is that civilization is normally won person by person. You know, not everybody operates at Dallas Jenkins' scale, but everybody operates with other people. And one person being won over is a tremendous victory. It's a tremendous victory. And the great thing is we have the guarantee we'll never lose, provided we never give up.
What a great note on which to finish. Greg, thank you. I think we've had fun this evening. That concludes the formal part of tonight. I think you know who you're now going to go and see. I think you now know the bookshop from where you will be buying How Christians Can Succeed Today. Thank you for your support.